supports the efforts of Senator Cardin and others to create an independent commission. We need to know what happened, why it happened, who was involved, and what we can do to prevent it from happening again. Answering these questions is critical to ensuring that America's relationship with Russia is based on American interests and values, not simply a special relationship between two presidents. We're lucky to have a senator like Ben Cardin leading this work, and we're proud to have him here at CAP today. So please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Carmel, thank you for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here at CAP. I thank you for all that you do on progressive causes and advancing this discussion on national security and foreign policy. Happy Valentine's Day. Maybe the love of Valentine's Day will come onto Capitol Hill and all of a sudden we'll all get along and there'll be a lot of progress that is made in our country. It's day 25 for those who are keeping track. We're 25% through the first 100 days. Every day is an adventure. Every day there's been news that has really tested, I think, our resolve. I want to back up a little bit and put this in context as to the U.S.-Russian relations, to talk a little bit about America's values. We start with what is America's strength? Our strength is in our values. Every day I have a chance to meet with foreign ministers and heads of state who come into my office to talk about the importance of the relationship with the United States. There's only one America. There's only one country that has the strength that we have that can promote values that are universal values. Those values include basic human rights. It includes fighting corruption. On human rights, the United States participated reluctantly initially in the Helsinki Accords in 1975, but then we used the Helsinki process to promote basic human rights. And it was the United States leadership that was able to advance from protecting the right of people to emigrate to dealing with trafficking in persons to recognizing that every country has a right to challenge other countries within the OSCE as to their record on human rights, because these are universal concerns, and they affect the stability of the global community. So we have a right to challenge that, and the United States has been the leader in standing up for people's rights around the world. And fighting corruption, it was a couple months ago, I guess maybe 6 months ago, I was invited to the White House for a National Security Council briefing on a matter that they felt was urgent to our national security. And it was, how can we fight corruption? That corruption is actually acting as a cancer to our systems of government. And what can we do to deal with human rights? So I could go on, but I look at my role as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to make sure that we stand up for America's values. We stand up for human rights. We stand up to fight corruption. And I've used my platform as a ranking member to remind my colleagues that this is what makes America strong. This is an incredibly important role that we play. So looking at Russia, we see the country that gives me the most concern of any country in the world because of their influence globally, that it's a corrupt regime. Mr. Putin depends upon corruption in order to run his type of government. And it's a country that does not respect basic human rights of its citizens. They don't enjoy human rights. And I've tried to put a face on this because we know the numbers. We know the thousands of people who have been persecuted by the Russian government, their own people in Russia. But we put a face on it with Sergei Magnitsky. Back in 2009, we were able to show a person who was a lawyer, a young lawyer, just trying to represent a client, discovered massive corruption within the Russian system. And he did what a lawyer is required to do. He reported it to the authorities. As a result, he was arrested, tortured, and killed. And the people who were responsible were not held accountable. They were promoted. And Democrats and Republicans came together in the United States Congress to pass the Sergei Magnitsky law that was aimed originally at Russia to say that if you don't punish these individuals, we're not going to give them the benefit of our country. We're not going to let them travel to America. We're not going to let them use our banking system. And as a result of U.S. leadership, other countries followed. And we established international standards on how we treat people who are guilty of gross violations of human rights that are not punished by their own country. And now we've made that global in the last Congress, and I was proud of all of that. Which brings me back to Russia. Russia today is a country that's posing tremendous threats by Mr. Putin's activities. We saw that this year, last year in 2016, when they attacked our free election system. We continue to see it in their activities in Ukraine, where they invaded Ukraine and illegally annexed Crimea. They continue to support the separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is causing death not only to the military, but also to civilians. And we see it in Syria, where they're complicitous in war crimes. But with the whole world saw that with what happened in Aleppo with the civilian casualties in their attack on humanitarian efforts. These are the facts. We're not arguing. This is what is happening today under Mr. Putin and Russia. We know what has happened. The question is, what do we do about it? And I want to start by saying I think the Trump administration has compromised itself in this regard. And I say that because it starts with what America stands for. And Mr. Trump, in taking over the presidency, with failing to release his tax returns, with not doing what every other president has done with his own personal wealth and business conflicts, no longer has the standing that America would normally have to question actions in other countries. So we've already, I think, compromised our ability, our credibility on these issues in dealing with Russia or dealing with other countries that commit corruption and fail to protect the rights of all of its citizens. So to me, it was shocking when President Trump continues to side with Russia. As we've seen over and over again, he criticizes every country, our allies, but for Russia, it seems like he won't say anything. He refuses to acknowledge the situation in Ukraine as a result of Russian aggression, even though there's no question about those facts. He questions our U.S. intelligence on Russia's involvement in our own election. And he appears to welcome cooperation with Russia in Syria, even though we know that Russia is complicitous in war crimes and is unreliable in any of the commitments that it makes. Bluntly, Trump's Russia policy, or lack thereof, is risky and dangerous to America. Perhaps the thing that got me the most concerned about this was the moral equivalency that he made in regards to Putin's murderous conduct and what he does in Russia versus any activities in the United States have any moral equivalency. It's just outrageous. Russia is not our friend. They have different values. They have different objectives. They're trying to bring down our democratic system of government. We need to acknowledge that. So what should we do? Well, first of all, we have to be strong. We have to be bipartisan. And we have to stand up for our values. We can't give Russia any space. You give them any space, they'll take it. They'll use it for aggression into other countries. They'll use it to interfere with the free election system. They will use any opportunity we give them, and we have to make sure that we do not give them the space to do other aggressive actions against our interests. Russia has attacked our democratic system. It was our political Pearl Harbor. It may have been by a mouse, but it was just as dangerous as a MiG. And we need to have a strong policy about that. The collective view of our intelligence community leaves no doubt that Russia was involved. They tried to manipulate and discredit our elections, and they favored one candidate over another. We cannot let that go unchallenged. A Russia dictator who allows no political dissent in his country to have any bearing on the trajectory of our election system. That is something that cannot stand. We must act. President Obama was right to impose sanctions. And of course, we were deeply troubled by General Flynn's contact, his misleading statements, now his resignation from the Trump administration. Let me go into that just a moment, because the first bill that I've introduced that I want to talk about is a bill that was set up an independent commission, similar to the 9/11 Commission, for us to have full-time people investigating what happened by Russia's involvement in our elections. General Flynn's contact raises concerns about that. We need to know more about this. We need to know whether there are deeper ties here. What was Russia's motivation in trying to interfere with our election? That's information that the American people need to know about so we can protect ourselves against similar activities in the future. And that can only, in my view, be done with the credibility of an independent commission. And I filed legislation to do this so that we can protect our country and take actions against those who have attempted to interfere with our free democratic system. I'm supportive of congressional investigations. I think they complement each other. An independent commission working with the different committees. There's certainly work being done by the Senate Intelligence Committee. I support that. There's work being done by the Armed Services Committee. I support that. There's work being done by the Judiciary Committee. I support all those investigations. And I equally support an investigation done by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I'm the ranking member. We have direct interest in knowing how do we deal with Russia. Let me just give you one example. It's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that's responsible for authorization on the use of force. Well, we were attacked. How do you respond to a cyber attack? What is cyber force? How do you define it? Only the Senate Foreign Relations Committee can really respond to that. And we need to be prepared as to how we respond to that particular issue. Russia will do this again if it's left unchallenged. And we're seeing it now, the concern of what's happening in Europe. We know that Netherlands, Germany, France are very concerned whether their elections will be interference by Russia. So in addition to finding out what happened and take steps to protect ourselves, I've introduced a second bill. This bill is counteracting Russia's reckless, hostile conduct. It's a comprehensive bill, and it's bipartisan. I'm joined by Republicans and Democrats, and it's a growing number that are joining us in this effort. The lead Republican is Senator McCain, and we really have reached out to a broader number. What it does, first, it codifies the President Obama's sanctions, so it has the force of law, not just executive action, on the action he took against Russia on their attack to our country. Secondly, it allows for an imposition of greater sanctions against Russia for its activities, including action against the defense and intelligence sector and anyone who does business with them. Third, it protects ourselves from Russia propaganda. This is a new area, people. This is a new area. It's just facts that are used. People use alternative facts. They use fake news. It's lies. And it's funded with substantial resources so that the lies appear to be facts when they're lies. And we can't be naive about it. They're using our democratic system against us to try to bring down our democratic system. And we need to have a financed effort to counter this Russian strategy to compromise our democratic system. And my legislation provides authorization for resources in order to be able to deal with that. Fourth, this bill would deal with the ongoing aggression by Russia in Syria. They're violating Minsk agreements. They're violating the Helsinki Accord on sovereignty of states. They are clearly supporting war crimes by targeting innocent civilians and destroying humanitarian convoys. What this provision in the bill would do would allow for sanctions against Russia for not participating in their sovereign debt or privatization efforts or its ability to develop its oil and gas fields. We deal with pipelines. We deal with the energy sector because that's where Russia desperately depends upon the regional and international community for the strength of their economy. Let me just point out, what's happening here is not a frozen conflict. This is an active hot war, and we have to respond in kind. We shouldn't be easing any sanctions on Russia unless they comply not only with Minsk but with their Helsinki commitments. The legislation also builds on what President Obama initiated with the European Deterrence Initiative. As I think most of you are aware, under President Obama, we have put equipment and we rotate troops through the Baltics and through Eastern Europe to show our sign of our commitment to defend the sovereignty of these countries against potential Russian aggression. This is a very important point, but we also have to bolster the European democracy. So I have what's known as the European Democracy Initiative, where we will help support the democratic institutions, the civil societies, strengthen what is under attack by Russia in trying to bring down our democratic system. The bill also provides for better cooperation on cybersecurity. This is particularly important to me as a senator from the state of Maryland. As you all know, the cyber center of the world is in the state of Maryland with Cyber Command and with all the different institutions such as University of Maryland. And so we very much want to share that expertise that we have. I believe we have the best expertise in the world. We need to share that capacity with our democratic allies so that they can better protect themselves. This legislation is a comprehensive approach to deal with Russia. I am hopeful that we'll have serious discussions in the United States Senate and House, and we'll have a robust debate, and we will pass that legislation. In the meantime, we need to hurry and pass another bill that I am on, that I led with, leading with Senator Graham. It's a bipartisan bill, again, includes Democrats and Republicans, that would deal with our concern about the president unilaterally reducing or eliminating sanctions on Russia as part of a conversation that he may have with Mr. Putin. What this legislation would do would be to set up a review process similar to what I helped craft for the Iran nuclear agreement. So before the president could release these sanctions or change the sanctions, he would have to notify Congress, give Congress an opportunity to have hearings for the American people to understand the Russian policy that the president is promoting, give us a chance to weigh in and perhaps change the trajectory of this discussion, or to pass legislation that would prevent that from occurring if there's that type of opposition in the United States Congress. The transparency alone will have a major positive impact on the way the president deals with the Russian policy. So let me just close, if I might, with a note about Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian opposition person, a courageous democratic activist in Russia who was poisoned in 2015. He asserted the government attacked him for his activism, and there's good reason to believe that Russia government was involved in his poisoning. He recovered, thank goodness. 2 weeks ago, we received word that he was in a coma, suffering from the same symptoms he had in 2015. The Russian government is clearly not finished with Mr. Kara-Murza. On June 7th last year, he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In his testimony, he said the following, and I want to quote from him, if I might. Our friends in the West often ask how they can be helpful in the cause of human rights and democracy in Russia. And the answer to this is very simple. Please stay true to your values. We are not asking you for support. It's our task to fight democracy and the rule of law in our country. The only thing we ask from Western leaders is they stop supporting Mr. Putin by treating him as a respectable, worthy partner, and by allowing Mr. Putin's cronies to use Western countries as havens for their looted wealth. Mr. Kara-Murza is right. We must stay true to our values. President Trump is treating Mr. Putin as a respectable, worthy partner. He should take heed from Mr. Kara-Murza's advice and stop that immediately. I pray that Mr. Kara-Murza will recover. We got word that he's out of his coma, is recovering slowly. We pray for him. We pray for his family, that he returns and continues to be an activist on behalf of human rights in his country. We also are very much for the Russian people. We want their country to reflect the values that are universal in human rights and anti-corruption. I just want to make it clear that this senator is going to continue to work across party line. It's going to continue to reach out to any one of my colleagues to work together so we can stand up for America's strength, our values, and for the right type of relationship with Russia. We know we have to engage Russia. We understand that. But when you engage Russia, recognize that they're not our friend. that they're trying to bring down our system of government. Approach them with strength and with resolve, and be willing to lead our international coalition that needs us to stand strong against Russia. That is our challenge, and that's what I hope the Congress, that the independent Article 1 branch of government will stand for in trying to create the right relationship between the United States and Russia. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator. That was terrific. I'm just going to ask a couple questions and then turn it over to our audience, so if you could all be thinking about your questions. Just to start with the thing that's in the news today with General Flynn's resignation, something that is kind of striking to me about the situation is, first of all, this is the second person who has resigned from the Trump organization based on public pressure about relationships with Russia. I think people forget that his campaign chair, Manafort, also resigned for similar reasons. And according to the Washington Post, Sally Yates had let the White House know about the concerns about Flynn a month ago. And seemingly they took no action, and he's only resigned today based on leaked information and public pressure. So I think that sort of raises the question of, this isn't really just about General Flynn. This is about the lack of action in response to what he did in the White House. So the White House's posture today is, well, we're putting that behind us. We'll have a new national security advisor and move forward. But it seems that we need to look more deeply into how the White House reacted to the news of General Flynn inappropriately talking to folks in Russia. And would just love to hear you speak a little bit to that, and if you think the congressional investigations are going to be able to adequately tackle that.
This is very much of concern. First of all, it appears that Russia was using their normal MO. They had information on General Flynn, and they knew that he was compromised and intended to keep that in mind if they ever needed to put pressure on the Trump administration, that they had an avenue through General Flynn to perhaps affect decisions in our government. That's blackmail and bribery and things like that, which is how Russia operates. Now, is General Flynn the only person who's been compromised? I don't know. We don't know. We need to understand the risk factors to our country. We know that they knew about the concerns on General Flynn several weeks ago, prior to President Trump taking the oath of office. And yet it was 25 days before action was taken, and that's of concern. We know that the Attorney General's office tried to give the Trump administration the advice as early as possible. We also know the principal person involved in there was fired for a different reason. All that raises concern that we need to get to the bottom of, because it's not just General Flynn. It's the manner in which this whole relationship has been handled and whether America's national security has been further compromised.
And one way to do that, obviously, would be if the legislation you've introduced was enacted and we were to get an independent commission like the one we had after 9/11. Imagine what the pushback you get towards your legislation is that we have three committees in Congress already investigating that it's not necessary. Could you speak to a little bit about how an independent commission would differ from the investigations that are happening?
And first of all, we're not naive about this. The Republicans control both houses of Congress and the White House. We are only 25 days into the Trump administration, but we have seen a reluctancy of using the congressional investigations to deal with many issues that have been raised that would normally be the subject of congressional interest. There's been lack of interest to move in that direction. The Senate has been very busy on confirmations. The House have been busy repealing regulations and repealing the Affordable Care Act, so they haven't had time to deal with these issues, supposedly. So there's been, I think, a lack of commitment for oversight in the Congress. I think there is a need for Congress to do oversight, and it's too early to tell whether the Senate committees will do adequate oversight on this issue. We have limited jurisdiction. The Intelligence Committee has authority over the Intelligence Committee, Senate Foreign Relations over the State Department and Foreign Policy, the Armed Services over the Department of Defense, the Judiciary Committee over some of the legal use of systems. But no committee has the broad jurisdiction to deal with the overall concern about what Russia was doing, meddling with our election. That requires an entity that has broader jurisdiction than any one of the 4 Senate committees that I've mentioned. It also, I think, requires full time. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I don't know how many of you follow our work, but we generally have about 2 hearings a week. We meet with about 4 or 5 leaders a week. It's a busy committee. And in addition to serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, most of the members serve on 2 or 3 other committees. We need full-time attention to this issue. This is a matter of national security and requires the attention of an independent commission with the resources necessary to get to the bottom of what Russia was doing, attacking us, and then using that information to try to influence our elections. So it cannot be done by a congressional committee, even though congressional committees need to be engaged.
That's great. In your job with as the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I'm sure you spend a great deal of your time with folks at the State Department. What is your sense of how Secretary Tillerson will engage in these issues?
Well, I think I've said this publicly, I'm going to repeat it. I think Secretary Tillerson is very sincere in serving our country. He has a great deal of background as far as negotiations are concerned. I think that could be very helpful to us. I am not confident as to how the Trump administration is going to handle foreign policy. It is not clear that Mr. Tillerson will be the principal person dealing with foreign policy. We've heard members of the Trump family, a member of the Trump family might have more to say than Mr. Tillerson does on this issue. So it's not clear as to how he's conducting, how the president will be receiving information on conducting foreign policy and how directives will be given by the Trump administration on foreign policy. We do know that the career people at State Department are incredibly gifted and knowledgeable in these subjects and have the expertise that are critically important. I very much respect Secretary Mattis's comments that if you don't support the State Department, you better give me some more troops, because the State Department keeps us safe without having to put our men and women in harm's way. So I hope that message will be accepted by the Trump administration and that the State Department will be tasked with keeping America safe through all the tools they have at their disposal, and that Mr. Tillerson will be the captain of that effort. If he is, I think he's a capable person. My main concern with him is I see him too transactional for business reasons versus what I said in my initial comments, that America's strength is in our values and that we should never trade an economic benefit for our basic values of human rights and anti-corruption. We should never compromise those principles. I hope that Mr. Tillerson will be a champion of that. I have my questions.
I'll turn it over to the audience. Does people have questions? Maybe right here in the front.
Morning, Senator Cardin, and thank you very much for your continued leadership on this issue. I had the privilege of working with you as a senior official in the Obama administration on these issues at both Commerce and AID, and you've been a long-standing standard bearer on these issues, and your leadership is more crucial than ever, I would say. I have 2 questions on the subject of leadership, actually. One is, in your conversations with your Republican colleagues and co-sponsors, are you sensing that they are concerned, among other things, about the growing risk of paralysis in our foreign policy as a result of what you referred to in your opening remarks as the fact that this may be just a non-policy at this point towards Russia, that as a result of this abundant confusion over what our priorities should be and how to engage and who may be compromised, that we're drifting now and we don't have an actual policy of any kind. And so therefore, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have to be concerned about, whether we're tying our hands at a time when Putin is capable tactically of doing any number of things. It's freeing up space, as you put it. So that's sort of one question I'd ask you to comment on. The other is, in light of this sort of same leadership vacuum, what are you saying to your counterparts in Kyiv, in Ukraine, about what they need to do to take more ownership of the good governance reform agenda, the anti-corruption agenda, and to, in effect, to create more sovereignty around their reform efforts, so that neither Russia nor a sort of paralyzed U.S. can interfere with that?
Well, first, I think Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly agree that you cannot conduct foreign policy by a tweet. And they disagree with the way Mr. Trump is proceeding on foreign relations. They did not, this is not I think it's pretty universal in Congress. We were extremely concerned, disappointed, worried, and thought reckless the way that he handled the initial tweet on China, how he handled the tweets on Mexico, how he handled his conversations with Australian Prime Minister, how he's dealing with Russia and complimenting them, how he's handling the attack on our country, how he's handling who's responsible in Ukraine. And the list goes on and on and on. And I hadn't even gotten to the Middle East yet. So I think there's general, real concern by both Democrats and Republicans. So there are different tacks we're taking. The election is over. So I think there is a different degree of confidence as to whether we can influence the Trump administration's structure to have a positive impact on foreign policy. Will a person like Mr. Tillerson make a real difference or not? So there's some different views among Democrats and Republicans, but there's certainly Republicans who are extremely anxious to get more reasoned views in the room before Mr. Trump makes his decisions. And that's been one of their top priorities. And we've seen a difference in confidence during the confirmation process as that relates. Secondly, there is views among Democrats and Republicans that we can influence, the Congress, can influence the Trump administration policies. And there's been some success on that. We've seen it with the transatlantic partnership. We saw what Mr. Trump said during the campaign, and even shortly after he took the office of presidency. That has toned down quite considerably. And we think that we have some responsibility in changing that discussion, because there is no difference between the Democrats and Republicans in the absolute essential importance of the transatlantic partnership to America's national security. So whether it's NATO, or whether it's the unity in Europe, or whether it is the reliance upon conversations with our European partners before the president makes decisions, we have been harping on the president to understand that importance, and we've made some progress. We think you'll see that with Montenegro's accession. I think that will happen soon. And I think that's another example of where the Congress is going to weigh in to reinforce the importance of the transatlantic partnership. And then there's the third area. The third area is can we influence the president by our direct actions? Can we pass legislation? And it'll be interesting to see how the bill that Senator Graham and I have introduced, how it is received. I hope it's received positively. Remember, there was a lot of opposition to President Obama acting unilaterally without Congress in an important foreign policy matter concerning Iran. Let's see whether the same standard is used by this Congress as it relates to Russia. That, to me, will be a major test point as to whether Congress will take on its proper role in regards to major foreign policy decisions. There are some Republicans who believe it can only be done with a treaty, so that if he were to do something major with Russia, they would assume that he would submit it to Congress as a treaty. We know the president's not going to do that. We heard his comments about the courts interfering with his power, so it's unlikely he's going to think Congress can interfere with his power. I'm not too concerned about the treaty confirmations, but I am concerned with us having an opportunity to weigh in before there's major concerns. You're right about Ukraine. Ukraine can't fall prey to the lack of progress on its democratic institutions. It just feeds into the Russian narrative and weakens the European resolve to work with the United States to isolate Russia. So it's critically important that Ukraine make continuous progress on developing its democratic institutions. There's been progress, but it's not fast enough and it's not strong enough. They need to continue to do that.
you. Laura Jewett from the National Democratic Institute. As a Maryland constituent and someone who works on democracy in Eurasia, I want to thank you also for your efforts on these areas. I just wanted to ask if you would comment on how close are we to an independent bipartisan investigation? How much Republican support is there and how much more do we need?
We have to convince the leadership, the Republican leadership in Congress, that that's what is needed. My guess is if you put this up for a vote, it was a secret ballot, it would pass overwhelmingly in Congress. But we don't put things up. Only the majority leader puts something up on the floor. The speaker puts it on the floor. So you have to convince the Speaker of the House and the majority leader of the Senate that this is the right thing to do. I have had no conversations or indirect conversations with Speaker Ryan. I know how Leader McConnell feels about this, and he's certainly not in favor of a special commission. So it's a matter of whether what happens out in the public with the reactions to what's going on puts pressure on Republicans who put pressure on Senator McConnell, or whether it's individual senators who recognize something needs to be done, whether that will happen. And the way things are going, it might very well happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much. Larry Checco. Shortly after the election, Senator, I asked I guess I could call him a leading Tea Party Republican congressperson, if in fact Donald Trump was truly the party's man. And his response to me was, he is until he isn't. And I found that very, very disturbing, because I don't really get the impression that Donald Trump and his administration is the leader of the Republican Party. I see them as kind of an isolated, insulated institution that's acting completely on its own. My real fear is, over the last 3 weeks, it seems like we're constantly moving towards chaos. When does the Congress step in and say this charade needs to end?
Well, I wish I had an answer for you on that. We're trying to accelerate that moment, and we're doing everything in our power to do that. I think a lot of Republicans agree with the statement you just made, but don't take away the fact that Mr. Trump won the election, and he gave the Republican Party the presidency. And he has a large constituency that was not traditionally voting for Republicans. And the Republican hierarchy sort of likes that. And they like the fact that the Democratic Party is in somewhat of a trying to reconfigure ourselves. So with the spotlight on the Democrats of being the party that needs to figure out what's going on, the Republicans are getting a free pass. And I think that will continue until the public determines that something needs to change. When that happens, I think the Republican hierarchy will recognize that Mr. Trump is not their future. But until then, Mr. Trump is the leader of the Republicans.
I think we have time for just one more question. Maybe over here on the left.
Hi, Joe Romer from the Irvington Group. You alluded to the uncertainty about foreign policy, and my question is, what would prevent you from calling someone from the Trump administration before your committee to lay out what the administration's policy is on foreign policy? I suspect they might have difficulty identifying someone that could cover the scope of foreign policy, but had you thought about that? Go ahead, I'm sorry. That's it.
No, that's a great question. The point is, the answer is yes, we will call the person who's responsible for that policy under the normal structure of government will come before our committee. Secretary Tillerson will be before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to defend not only the agency's budget, but the agency's how foreign policy is being configured, and he will be asked questions from Russia to Cuba. There's no question about it. My concern is he the right person? We can't call Jared Kushner. He has no official capacity. We're not allowed to bring in, I shouldn't say we're not allowed. the Republican leadership of our committee will respect the traditional bounds of the presidential advisors not being asked to come before a congressional committee. That would be very unusual. It may happen that they have to come before our committee for a particular purpose, but generally that is not how you do it. And it's somewhat insulting to the Secretary of State. So I'm not sure how we get to your specific question. And even if we get a clear, defined policy by Mr. Tillerson, we know that President Trump has surprises at times on foreign policy. And how does that gel? And we know that we don't think everyone is sharing the same information. We saw that in regards to General Flynn, where there were different messages coming out from different people within the Trump administration. So I think there's a fundamental problem of structure within the Trump administration that doesn't lend itself for Congress getting a clear representation on a major foreign policy issue. What we will try to do is have input before he announces that decision. We recognize that it's a new administration. We recognize that it's not as up to date on some of the areas as we would like them to be at the presidential level. We know they have that information within the State Department. They certainly should have that within the National Security Council. But we want to make sure that information also gets through us and that there's more flow back and forth with Congress. I'm going to give the president a little bit of a break here. He's only been in office 25 days. He certainly hasn't figured out how he's going to do business yet. At least I hope he hasn't figured out how he's doing business yet, because what we've seen so far is not encouraging. We hope that this will figure out a way of being done. I don't chalk this all off inexperience. There's no excuse for using a tweet for major foreign policy announcements. That's not how it should be done, particularly when they are irresponsible and reckless announcements. So we hope that will clarify itself as we move forward. Let me just, I guess, conclude on this. Our protection in our country is our checks and balance, our democratic system of government, the free press, and the institutions that we have. All of us have to strengthen that resolve. The president said things I've disagreed with over these last 25 days. But perhaps one of the ones that probably hurt the most is what he said about our courts. You know, the courts can't defend themselves. They depend upon all of us to protect the integrity of the courts. They don't have any army. They don't have any way of doing a budget. You know, Congress can protect itself. I can pass laws or help pass laws, and we have the power of the purse string. The president certainly doesn't need anybody to protect himself. He has power of executive order, as we've seen, and he can send troops wherever he wants to. The courts don't have that. So the protection of the judicial branch of government is critically important during these times, particularly when you have a president who's going to push his power as far as he possibly can. So strengthening the courts is going to be very important. For the Congress to exercise its independent role is going to be very, very important. And I say that whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president. Normally, the one thing you can get Congress to agree on is that we need to be a check on the president. You know, we know there's never been a president like Congress, whether it was of his own party or not, because we're too many and it's too inconvenient for him to deal with us. We need to exercise our independent oversight authority. Oversight is probably one of the most important functions that the Congress has. It's been only 25 days. Let's see how this shakes out over a little bit longer period of time. And we got to protect the free press. We know it's been challenged, and we know it's a different type of a press environment than it was with the internet and social media, et cetera. We've got to protect the free press. And if we do that, I am very confident we're going to get through this period. And our country is going to continue to be the great leader that it is for democracy and human rights globally. But it doesn't come without us actively working on that. And one of the positive things that I've seen in the last 25 days, maybe a little before that, is the energy that's out there on the streets. And this is not Democrats, it's not Republicans, it's the energy that's on the streets on issues. We saw it with the Women's March, we saw it on the executive order on immigration. I see it every day on the phone calls and emails and texts that are coming into our office. People really want to be engaged in their system. They're more energized now to protect our democratic system than I've seen in a long time. We got to take that energy and turn it into a positive part of our government so that we not only get through this period, but America continues to lead the world on these critical values that have made America the great nation it is. I'm a senator. I'm optimistic. I hope this will happen, but we need your help. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cardin. I know you have to get back for a vote. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for coming.